Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when we think about politics, our minds usually jump straight to politicians in suits, voting booths, and Capitol buildings. Basically, the official machinery of government. But what if I told you all of that is just the very tip of a massive hidden structure? Today, we're diving deep into the world of political sociology to uncover how hidden social forces, things like your family, your social class, your community, are actually the secret engines running our governments.
To guide our dive below the surface, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the political iceberg, look at the origins of the intruder, uncover the roots of political power, explore the pioneers and crises that built the field, and finally wrap up with why it matters.
Let's jump right in. Section 1, the political iceberg, beyond the machinery.
So traditional political science has historically been pretty obsessed with the formal machinery of government. It asks questions like, how do public administrations operate, or how are laws officially passed? But political sociology? Well, it takes a completely different approach. It analyzes the massive social structures that actually surround and influence those institutions. We're talking about looking at social conflict, power distribution, and the really messy interplay between society and politics. Because, as you'll see, they aren't separate spheres at all. They are deeply, deeply entangled.
To really ground this discussion, let's look at the famous sociologist Max Weber. Weber defined the state powerfully and very concretely as an institution that claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of force within a given territory. Think about that for a second. Now, while traditional political scientists study the mechanics of that institution, political sociologists ask the juicier questions. Who exactly gets to control that legitimate force? And how does the broadest society either accept or resist that monopoly?
There's a great quote from our source material that perfectly captures this whole dynamic. It reads, "Political science has tended to concentrate on the visible part of the political iceberg, whereas political sociology has paid greater attention to the submerged portions. It is absolutely crucial to understand this core metaphor. If the formal state is the visible tip of the iceberg, then society itself is the massive, submerged foundation holding the whole thing up. You simply cannot understand how the iceberg moves by only looking at the ice above the water."
Moving right along to Section 2, Origins of the Intruder, Disrupting the Status Quo.
Now, when political sociology started gaining traction in the U.S. academic scene around the 1930s, it was actually viewed as kind of an intruder discipline. Traditional political scientists were honestly a bit defensive. Why? Because this new field shattered a very comforting myth, the ideal typical citizen. You know, classical democratic theory loved to imagine this purely rational citizen who dispassionately studies the issues in complete isolation and then logically casts a vote. While political sociology intruded on this fantasy to essentially say, no way, that is definitely not how humans work. It proved that our choices are never made in a vacuum.
Which brings us to Section 3, the roots of political power, where beliefs begin.
Okay, here is a question I really want you to ask yourself right now. Where do your political views actually come from? No, really think about it. You might feel like you arrived at your current beliefs purely through your own independent research and flawless logic. But the study of political socialization tells a completely different story.
It turns out, our political identities are molded by what sociologists call agents of socialization. And man, they start incredibly early. We're talking about your family, your school, your neighborhood, and your peer groups essentially building your political personality from the ground up. In fact, political socialization can even begin in the nursery. Literally, the source material points out that our adult attitudes toward authoritarian or permissive styles in international relations might actually be rooted firmly in our early childhood experiences with authority figures. It is wild, but we really are products of our social environments.
Let's shift gears and look at the history in Section 4, Pioneers and World Crises, Forged in Fire.
Let's walk through how extreme world events basically force scholars to look deeper into societal behaviors. Foundational concepts actually go way back to the mid-19th century, with thinkers like Karl Marx and Max Weber trying to make sense of the Industrial Revolution. But the discipline with its specific name really emerged in the early 1930s, largely because the world was in absolute crisis. I mean, the rise of fascism, communist revolutions, the massive upheaval leading to the Second World War, these events made it undeniably clear that merely studying the formal rules of a government just wasn't cutting it anymore. Scholars realized they desperately needed to understand the deep group psychology and mass movements that could literally topple democratic institutions. And this eventually sparked a post-WW2 behavioral revolution, using hard data to study actual human behavior.
So to figure out how societies were actually functioning, these early pioneers zeroed in on 5 specific focus areas. First up, voting behavior and public opinion. Second, the concentration of economic power. They used mathematical models to see how economic elites actually drove decisions. Third, they analyzed the underlying ideologies of mass movements. Fourth, they looked to political parties and voluntary associations, uncovering how small oligarchies often run them. And fifth, government bureaucracy, examining how really rigid rules could subvert democratic goals and become straight-up oppressive. Essentially, they were mapping out the true mechanics of power.
Let's move to our final section, Section 5, Why Political Sociology Matters, a Global Lens.
So what does this all mean? Why does this discipline matter today? The absolute biggest reason is that it exposes informal power. Political sociologists look right past the formal legal channels of government to see what is really happening in the shadows. They investigate how unofficial groups, whether we're talking about exclusive businessmen's clubs, specific ethnic associations, or highly networked local power elites, can quietly bypass or just entirely subvert the formal democratic process. Seriously, if you only look at the official rulebook, you are going to completely miss who is actually pulling the strings.
And it's important to note that this analytical framework isn't just for Western democracies. While the field definitely started by analyzing the post-industrial realities of Europe and America, it quickly expanded and became essential for a truly global understanding of politics. As new, independent nations emerged from colonialism, scholars realized pretty quickly that Western models couldn't just be copy-pasted. In the Third World context, researchers had to look at how entirely different dynamics, things like caste systems, deep ethnic divisions, and the messy transition from traditional to modern economies, fundamentally altered how political institutions functioned. Political sociology gives us that flexible lens required to understand political reality literally anywhere on Earth. To wrap this explainer up, let's think back to our political iceberg. We started by realizing that the vast majority of political power lies hidden deep beneath the surface of society. We've learned that our very own political views are socialized into us, sometimes starting as early as the nursery. So I want to leave you with this thought to ponder. If our political reality is shaped by these invisible social forces, forces formed long before we ever step foot into a voting booth, who is truly steering the ship?